It was a quiet afternoon in the suburban neighborhood where Sarah lived. She had always loved the peace and calm that came with her home. Sarah had recently adopted a cat named Simba, a playful and affectionate companion who quickly became her best friend. She would often spend hours in her garden, sitting under the tall oak tree with Simba by her side. It was a simple life, one filled with moments of joy and relaxation. That afternoon, as Sarah was enjoying a warm cup of tea on her porch, Simba darted out of the house, chasing a butterfly that fluttered by. Sarah smiled at the sight of her cat's playful chase, but what happened next completely shattered the peaceful moment. A police officer drove by on the street in his patrol car. Sarah had never seen him before, but she assumed he was just doing his rounds. The officer, however, noticed Simba running around in the yard and immediately pulled over. He got out of the car, his hand resting on the baton at his side. At first, Sarah didn't think much of it. Police officers sometimes passed through the neighborhood, but this one seemed to be lingering longer than usual. Before Sarah could even wave to greet him, the officer approached Simba. In his haste to control the situation, he pulled out his baton and aimed it toward the cat, thinking it might be dangerous. "Hey, stop right there," the officer barked, his voice stern. Simba, startled by the officer's sudden approach, scampered away in the opposite direction. But before Sarah could react or call her cat back, the officer acted quickly. In one swift movement, he swung the baton. The officer, who seemed to be startled by Simba's sudden movement, didn't take the time to think carefully. The baton struck the cat with such force that Simba yelped in pain and collapsed. Sarah gasped in shock, rushing to her pet's side. Her heart raced as she knelt down to check on Simba, who was now lying on the ground, motionless. "What did you do to him?" Sarah exclaimed, her voice filled with disbelief and fear. The officer stood frozen, realizing that his actions had been far too aggressive. He muttered something about fearing the cat was going to attack, but Sarah couldn't understand how he could have thought that. Simba had only been playing in the yard, harmless and innocent. "I'm so sorry," the officer stammered, but Sarah didn't want to hear any of it. The damage had already been done. Simba's limp body lay in her arms as she tried to comfort him, her hands shaking. She couldn't believe it. How could anyone, especially an officer, harm her pet like this? It felt unreal. "I'm calling for help," Sarah said, her voice filled with panic. She immediately took out her phone and dialed the number for animal services, her mind racing. She didn't know how long Simba would last, but she had to do everything in her power to save him. As she frantically tried to reach help, the officer stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to say next. His face reddened with embarrassment, but there was no comfort for Sarah. The trauma of seeing Simba hurt, especially by someone who was supposed to protect, was too much for her to process at that moment. Moments later, animal services arrived, but despite their efforts to save Simba, the poor cat couldn't be revived. The officer had acted without thinking, and now Sarah was left holding the weight of this painful moment, with no clear answers or justice. The officer had no idea just how much he had impacted her life with a single reckless action. But what the officer didn't know was that Sarah's father wasn't just any ordinary person. He was the president, a powerful figure who wouldn't let his daughter's pain go unnoticed. The consequences of this incident would ripple far beyond Sarah's quiet home in the suburbs. But for now, Sarah was left with her grief, her heart heavy as she looked at Simba's lifeless form. The police officer, still standing near Sarah, watched as she cradled Simba in her arms, her tears falling silently onto his fur. It was clear that the weight of what had just happened was sinking in. The officer tried to apologize again, but Sarah wasn't in a place to hear it. Her mind was too clouded with anger and disbelief. How could this happen? How could someone who was supposed to protect others cause so much harm? Without saying another word to the officer, Sarah quickly stood up, holding Simba's lifeless body in her arms. She made her way back to her house, her heart heavy with sorrow. Every step she took felt as though the world was moving slower, as though everything had changed in that single moment. Simba wasn't just a pet to her. He was a member of the family, a companion who had brought joy and comfort during difficult times. And now he was gone, all because of one officer's thoughtless action. Once inside, Sarah sat down at the kitchen table, still holding Simba. She couldn't believe what had happened. Her phone lay on the counter, still open with the number for animal services. She had called them, but there was nothing more they could do now. Simba was gone, and the officer's apology didn't seem to bring any comfort. In that moment, Sarah knew she needed to take action. This couldn't just be ignored. The officer's mistake had taken something precious from her, and she wasn't going to let it slide. It wasn't just about the harm done to Simba. It was about the injustice of it all. How many other people had suffered because of careless actions like this? How many times had officers acted without considering the consequences? Sarah knew this wasn't just her fight. It was something bigger. She pulled herself together and began to think. The officer had no idea who she was, but Sarah's father did. He wasn't just anyone. He was the president. As soon as Sarah realized the weight her father's position carried, she knew she had to let him know what had happened. The President of the United States wasn't someone who could be easily reached, but Sarah had always been close to her father. She was determined that he would know about the incident, and she would make sure that justice would be served for Simba. Taking a deep breath, Sarah dialed her father's private line. It didn't take long for him to pick up, and she could hear the concern in his voice as soon as he recognized her number on the caller ID. "Sarah, what's wrong?" her father asked, his voice steady but filled with worry. "Dad, it's Simba. He's gone." Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. "An officer. He hurt him. I need you to help me." The words spilled out quickly, her grief turning into anger as she retold the story. She explained how the officer had acted without thinking, how Simba had been playing in the yard when the officer approached him, and how he had used unnecessary force. She described how the officer had struck Simba, and how, despite the best efforts of animal services, Simba couldn't be saved. Her father listened in silence, but Sarah could feel the weight of his concern on the other end of the line. He knew that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger problem. It was clear that his daughter wasn't just mourning the loss of her pet. She was standing up for justice. Sarah wasn't the type to sit back and let something like this go unnoticed, and neither was her father. "I'll make sure this is handled," her father said firmly. "No one should have to go through something like this. I'll take care of it, Sarah. Just give me a moment to get everything in motion." Sarah felt a mix of relief and gratitude wash over her. She knew that her father's position held immense power, and that he would use it to make sure this incident didn't go unnoticed. But more than that, she felt a sense of hope. Hope that what had happened to Simba wouldn't be in vain, and that the officer would be held accountable for his actions. With the phone call over, Sarah sat down on the couch, still clutching Simba's collar in her hands. As much as she wanted to rest, she knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice had just started. Sarah wasn't about to let anyone forget the pain she had endured or the injustice she had witnessed. It was time to make sure her voice, and Simba's memory, would be heard. The following day, Sarah woke up early. Her mind was still reeling from the events of the previous afternoon. Her house was quiet, but her heart felt heavy. Simba's collar sat on the kitchen table, a stark reminder of what had happened. The memories of her cat lying lifeless in her arms were too fresh to ignore, and she knew she couldn't just move on. Her father, the president, had assured her that things would be taken care of, but she knew that it would take more than just a call. She needed to make sure the officer was held accountable. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about fairness. How many people had been treated unfairly because of one officer's actions? How many other innocent pets or people had suffered because someone failed to act responsibly? This needed to change. Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. She knew the police officer who had hurt Simba didn't realize who she was. It didn't matter. What mattered now was that he understood the consequences of his actions. This was more than a simple mistake. It was a demonstration of carelessness and lack of empathy. She grabbed her phone and called her best friend, Maya. Maya was an attorney and had always been the one Sarah turned to for advice when things got tough. The phone rang twice before Maya picked up. "Sarah, what's going on?" Maya asked, sensing the seriousness in her voice. "I need your help," Sarah replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I need to make sure this doesn't just get swept under the rug." Maya listened as Sarah explained what had happened the day before. She told her about the officer, his actions, and how Simba had ended up dead. Maya took a deep breath and then spoke. "You're right," Maya said thoughtfully. "This is more than just about you and Simba. This officer needs to be held accountable. You can't just let this go." "I know," Sarah said, her voice firm. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure something like this doesn't happen again." The two of them talked for another hour, discussing ways to get the story out there, ways to make sure the officer's actions wouldn't be ignored. Maya promised to help her get legal support, and Sarah knew that with Maya by her side, they could make sure this didn't just disappear. The next step was to gather evidence. Sarah knew she had to act quickly. She went back to the park where the incident had happened and started asking around. She found a few witnesses who had seen the officer approach Simba and heard the confrontation. One of them had even managed to take a video on their phone, which showed the officer using excessive force. Sarah felt a sense of relief wash over her as she watched the video. It was clear what had happened. She couldn't believe it had been caught on camera, but now she had something tangible to show the world. She took the video and sent it to Maya, who promised to have it analyzed by a professional. As the day went on, Sarah worked with Maya to draft a statement, one that would demand action. They wanted to make sure that everyone knew what had happened, and they were prepared to take it to the media if they had to. This wasn't about getting attention. It was about justice. It was about making sure no one else would have to go through what she had. By the end of the day, Sarah felt like a weight had been lifted. She wasn't just sitting back anymore. She was doing something. She was fighting for Simba, for herself, and for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. As Sarah lay in bed that night, she couldn't help but think about her father. She knew he would help, but she also knew this wasn't something he could fix alone. This was her fight too, and she was ready to see it through to the end. As the days passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was doing something important. What had started as a personal tragedy had become much bigger. It wasn't just about Simba anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and showing the world that no one, no matter their position, should be above the law. With Maya's help, Sarah worked on drafting a public statement. They knew they needed the truth to come out, and the only way to do that was to share the evidence they had gathered. Maya suggested that they approach a local news outlet first. If they could get the media's attention, it would put more pressure on the police force to respond. That afternoon, Sarah met with a reporter from a local news station. He listened closely as Sarah explained what had happened, her voice calm but filled with determination. She showed him the video of the officer's actions, and the reporter's face changed as he watched. He understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a story about a pet. It was about the way people in power were treating others. "We'll run this story," the reporter said, his voice firm. "But you have to understand, this could get big. It's going to get people talking, and it could put a lot of pressure on the police force. Are you ready for that?" Sarah took a deep breath. It wasn't going to be easy, but she wasn't backing down. "I'm ready. This is something that needs to be heard." The story ran the next day. The video was shown, and Sarah's statement was read aloud. It didn't take long for the public to react. Social media was flooded with messages of support. People were outraged that an officer had acted so recklessly and cruelly, especially when he hadn't even known who Sarah was. The hashtag Justice for Simba began to trend, with people from all over the city, and even the country, demanding answers. The police department didn't stay silent for long. The story put pressure on them to act, and within hours, they issued a statement. The officer who had been involved was placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation was launched. The department promised to review the incident thoroughly. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. The wheels were in motion, but this wasn't over yet. She had taken the first step, but there was still much more to do. She knew that the fight for justice was going to take time, but the support from the community gave her hope. As Sarah sat with her family that night, she couldn't help but feel grateful. Her father, the president, had already made calls to ensure the investigation was handled fairly, but he had told her time and again that this wasn't about using his power to fix things. It was about making sure that the truth came out and that justice was served. "Your voice is powerful, Sarah," he had told her earlier. "You've started something, and now it's up to you to see it through." With her father's encouragement and Maya's legal expertise, Sarah knew that she wasn't alone in this fight. She had the strength of her family, her community, and everyone who believed in justice behind her. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but Sarah was ready. This fight was bigger than her. It was about standing up for what was right, for Simba, and for everyone who had been wronged. She wouldn't stop until justice was served. The days that followed were filled with a mix of emotions for Sarah. On one hand, she felt proud of how far she had come. The support she was receiving was overwhelming, and more people were rallying behind her. On the other hand, the pressure was mounting. She knew this fight wasn't going to be easy, and the reality of what she was up against started to sink in. Maya kept reminding Sarah to stay focused, to keep pushing forward, no matter how tough things got. "You've already done so much," Maya would say, "but this is just the beginning." As Sarah sat in her living room, watching the news, she saw a report about the officer involved in Simba's death. The police department had made a public statement saying that they were deeply concerned about the incident and were committed to a thorough investigation. It sounded reassuring, but Sarah wasn't convinced. Words alone weren't enough. She needed real action. The next few days brought more twists. Protests started to grow around the city. People were holding signs that read "Justice for Simba" and "No more abuse of power." Sarah didn't want violence or anger to take over the movement, but she couldn't deny that the injustice had stirred something in people. It was clear that they were tired of seeing those in power act without consequence. In the meantime, Maya was working tirelessly, making calls, gathering evidence, and meeting with legal experts. She had already reached out to several organizations that could help amplify Sarah's message. One of them, a well-known civil rights group, offered to take on the case and help navigate the legal process. Sarah's father, the president, kept his promise to support her, but he knew that he had to remain neutral in public. He couldn't use his position to interfere with the investigation, no matter how much he wanted to protect his daughter and her cause. However, he made sure that the investigation was being handled fairly and that all necessary resources were being used to uncover the truth. One evening, Sarah received a phone call that she had been waiting for. It was from a local attorney who had been closely following the case. The officer who had hurt Simba was still on administrative leave, but the attorney assured Sarah that they were seeing some positive signs. The internal review was progressing, and there were indications that the officer might face disciplinary action. "Are you ready for the next step?" the attorney asked. Sarah hesitated for a moment. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but she also knew how difficult it would be. She was about to make a big decision. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'm ready." The next step would be a formal demand for accountability. If the investigation didn't lead to justice, Sarah and Maya were prepared to take legal action. It wasn't just about seeking justice for Simba anymore. It was about setting an example. It was about showing that no one, no matter their job or position, should be allowed to act with impunity. As Sarah sat down that night, she felt a sense of resolve. The road ahead was uncertain, and there were many challenges to overcome. But she had come this far, and she was not going to stop now. With her father's support, Maya's guidance, and the growing momentum from the community, Sarah knew she could make a difference. The fight for Simba wasn't just about one cat. It was about standing up to injustice, no matter how powerful the forces at play. The next chapter in her journey was about to begin. Sarah was ready. As the days passed, Sarah continued to receive both public and private messages of support. The community rallied around her cause. Online petitions were started, and social media campaigns spread like wildfire. Every day, more people shared their stories of how they had faced similar injustices. It was becoming clear that Sarah was not alone in this fight. But Sarah knew that, in order to make real change, it wasn't enough to have public support. She needed to take action. Every conversation she had, whether with Maya or anyone else, focused on moving forward. What steps could they take next to ensure that justice was served? Maya continued to push forward, contacting news outlets and legal teams. The legal team they had connected with was prepared to take the case to court if necessary. They had seen too many cases where the police were not held accountable, and they were determined to do whatever it took to make sure the officer who had harmed Simba didn't get away with it. It was late one afternoon when Sarah received a call from Maya with some news. The police department had scheduled a public hearing to address the incident involving Simba. The hearing was going to take place within the next week, and this was Sarah's chance to make her voice heard. Maya urged Sarah to prepare herself for the hearing. "This is your moment, Sarah. The world is watching. You need to be strong." Sarah wasn't sure what to expect at the hearing. She had never been in a situation like this before, but she knew this was her opportunity to stand up for what was right. She thought about Simba, about how her cat had been wrongfully hurt, and how this incident represented so much more than just one single event. The day of the hearing arrived, and Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. As she walked into the building, reporters and cameras were everywhere. She felt the weight of the moment, but she also felt the support of the many people who had reached out to her. This wasn't just about Simba anymore. It was about accountability and justice for everyone who had ever been wronged. As the hearing began, Sarah took the stand. She spoke clearly and with passion about the events that had led up to the incident, the pain she felt, and the deep concern she had about the way the police handled the situation. She shared how her father, the president, had supported her from the very beginning, and how they were both determined to ensure that nothing like this happened again. Sarah's voice shook at times, but she held her ground. She wasn't going to back down. After Sarah's testimony, other members of the community came forward to share their own experiences. People spoke about incidents of police brutality, mistreatment, and the lack of accountability. It was a powerful moment. It wasn't just Sarah's voice that was heard. It was the voice of the entire community. The police officers involved in the incident were given the opportunity to speak. One of them, the officer who had hurt Simba, stood up and apologized. He said he hadn't meant to hurt the cat or Sarah and expressed regret for his actions. However, many felt that this apology wasn't enough. Words were easy, but actions spoke louder. After the hearing, Sarah was exhausted but determined. She knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready. The pressure was building, and now more people were standing behind her than ever before. She felt a sense of hope that the system could change, that people could hold those in power accountable. But she also understood that change wouldn't happen overnight. What Sarah did next would be crucial, and she was prepared to see this fight through to the end. The challenge had only just begun, but she was more determined than ever to make sure Simba's death wasn't in vain. The weeks that followed the public hearing were filled with anticipation. Sarah knew that the outcome of the investigation and the actions that would follow were out of her hands. The police department had promised to take the findings seriously, but Sarah still felt a sense of urgency. It wasn't just about justice for Simba anymore. It was about ensuring that her community could trust those meant to protect them. Despite the pressure, Sarah remained focused. Every night, she went to bed thinking about what needed to happen next. She knew she couldn't let the incident be forgotten, and her determination grew stronger with each passing day. The support from her community continued to grow as well, and she started receiving letters and messages from people across the country who had been inspired by her strength. One evening, after a long day of meetings with legal teams and community leaders, Sarah received a call that would change everything. It was from the police department. The officer who had shot Simba had been formally charged with misconduct, and disciplinary actions were being taken. The officer would be dismissed from the force, and there was also a commitment to improve training for all officers to prevent similar situations from happening again. At first, Sarah couldn't believe it. She had worked so hard for this moment, and now it was finally happening. She had fought for Simba, but this victory wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had ever been wronged. She felt a mixture of relief and pride, knowing that her voice had made a difference. Her father, the president, called her shortly after she received the news. He congratulated her on the progress that had been made, but Sarah knew that there was still much more to do. "This is just the beginning," he told her. "You've opened doors, and now it's time for the real change." Rachel smiled at her father's words. She had come so far, but she was aware that the fight for justice and fairness was ongoing. There were still many issues to address, but the progress they had made was undeniable. As the news spread about the officer's dismissal, people in the city began to celebrate. Protesters, who had once gathered in anger, were now marching in solidarity, celebrating the victory they had won together. It wasn't just about a single officer anymore. It was about the power of community and the strength that comes from standing together. Sarah spent the next few days reflecting on the journey she had been on. She thought about the pain of losing Simba, the anger she felt when she first learned of the officer's actions, and the tireless work that had gone into seeking justice. But she also thought about the hope she now felt. Change was possible, and it had been achieved not just through words, but through action. Even though she had been personally impacted by the incident, Sarah realized that the true victory was in the broader change that had begun to take place. The message had been heard loud and clear. People were standing up for what was right, and the system was starting to respond. While there was still work to be done, Sarah knew that this moment was something to be proud of. As she sat by the window, watching the sunset over her quiet neighborhood, she felt a sense of peace. The journey had been long, but it had been worth it. She had not only found justice for Simba, but had also helped spark a movement for fairness and accountability. For Sarah, the fight wasn't over, but she was no longer fighting alone. She had the strength of her community, her family, and all those who believed in justice by her side. And that gave her the courage to keep going, no matter what came next. This chapter had closed, but the story was far from finished.